Good evening. My name is Ashok Gurung. I'm the director of India-China Institute, and I'm really happy. I'm really happy because weather is good, but despite weather becoming really good, that a lot of you chose to be with us this evening. That really says a lot about your interest, and I'm pretty sure you will not be disappointed, with the presentation that we have for you. So I really want to thank all of you for being here. Before I introduce our main speaker and three discussants, I just want to take a few minutes to thank a few individuals and also for the few organizations who have made this possible. First, really, I never get to thank my office team, and since one of our colleagues, she's a graduate student here, Christina, she's our events coordinator. She really works so hard, and she has put together many great events this semester. So I want to thank Christina today, formally. And also there are a number of other graduate students who work at ICI as research assistants, research associates, Chris Cruz, Shalini Kishan, I don't know who else is around here. So there are a number of them. Some of them are still working in the office because we have a major symposium this coming Monday. So thanks to everyone in the office. Special thanks to Rubin Foundation. Rubin Museum, as many of you probably know, is in the neighborhood. They have amazing collection of art from that part, Himalaya. And also they do a lot of amazing public events. So Rubin Foundation made a special grant to the new school, to Lang College, and to India-China Institute. And here, we got this grant mainly because of another grant that we received from another wonderful foundation called Luce Foundation. And I'm delighted that our colleague, Toby Wollman, who is from the Luce Foundation, is here. Really, thanks to Toby for making actually all of this possible, because what that grant does is help us bring people like David Zurick and Siddiq, Wahid, and several others, other scholars who really have devoted a big chunk of their life and especially their scholarship and focused in the Himalayas. So I just want to thank both Luce Foundation and also Rubin Foundation for making this evening possible. And a special regret from the Dean of Lang College, Stephanie Browner, who was scheduled to make opening remarks, but she had to go to Cambodia for a special assignment. But again, I want to thank all the colleagues from Lang College who are present here for really making this evening possible. Now let me turn to the main speaker, Professor David Zurick. David is a very good friend of mine, and David really is a man of many talents. He identifies himself as someone who's trained as a geographer, a world-class photographer, who really, as he tells in his biography, he left home sometime in 1975 on a journey on, many of you might recognize, overland trail from Europe to Asia. And since then, I think he has been traveling. And he has been traveling and devoting a big chunk of his time in Himalayas, both to really look at issues in that part of the world from a scientific development perspective, as well as really through his lens, capturing many of the intangibles that are equally important in understanding Himalayas. He completed his PhD in geography at the University of Hawaii at East-West Center, Honolulu, and he has written extensively about Asia and the Pacific. His writings and photography have won numerous awards, including the National Outdoor Book Award in 2006 for Illustrated Atlas of the Himalaya, and the Mount Everest Award in 2009 for his Himalaya studies. This past summer, I had a privilege of having him and my team to really visit a very special place called Kailash, which is in the southwestern part of Tibet, very close to the border of Nepal and India. And it was at that time, when you travel for about 2 weeks, sleeping in, tight, places, traveling together and hiking, through all these amazing places, you could really get to know people and very well. And David is really one of those people who, is really amazing, both as a student of Himalayas and as a scholar of Himalayas. So I'm really delighted that he could join us today to show some of his work. His book, on the basis of that book is what this lecture is all about. It's called The Land of Pure Vision: Sacred Geography of Tibet and the Himalaya. Is going to be published this summer, right? So if you're interested, please let us know, and we will connect you and how you can order that. And let me now briefly introduce 3 discussants. They too have very long and very accomplished resume, but I'll be brief. We'll be joined by Mark Larrimore. Mark is a colleague and another really key collaborator for a project at India-China Institute called Everyday Religion and Sustainable Environments in the Himalaya. And Mark, too, was part of this team that went to Kailash this past summer. And Mark is a professor of religious studies at Eugene Lang College. Mark is right there. He earned his BA in philosophy, politics, and economics from Worcester College, and his Oxford, his PhD in religion from Princeton University. He has published widely, and he's really a philosopher who is also very keen on looking at the lived aspect of religion, and has become very, very engaged in the Himalayas recently, and I'm really delighted to have him as a colleague. The second discussant is Professor Dominique Townsend. She's a postdoc fellow at Columbia University and is the head of interpretation at the Rubin Museum of Art. She has master's from Harvard Divinity School and PhD from Columbia's Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures. Her research focuses on intersections of Tibetan Buddhism and broader culture with focus on high culture, education, and aesthetics. So I'm really delighted that Dominique is also able to join us and partly represent Rubin Foundation Rubin Museum. Thank you. And our third panelist is Professor Siddiq Wahid. He was recently Vice Chancellor of Islamic University of Science and Technology in Jammu and Kashmir. He is someone that I've recently gotten to know him, but I've been hearing a lot about him from many of my mutual friends, a person of many, many talents, a historian by training. He got his PhD from Harvard University, but really someone who combines scholarship in ways that really connects to both policy questions as well as people looking at issues in our part of the world, that is Himalaya, from multiple different perspectives. He has served in corporate sector. He, as I said, he was part of the higher education sector in India. And recently, I understand that he is deeply involved in basically both, convening and helping to move, conversations around conflict in Jammu Kashmir, towards, much more positive direction than it has been. A very tough task indeed. And in his own family history is very interesting. He really, we were laughing earlier, where is he from and where am I from? It gets very complicated. Very well connected to Lhasa, western part of Tibetan areas, and the whole trading, circuit that people associate, when you think about Himalayas. So I'm really delighted. Siddiq is also here. So the basic format of today's talk is we will now request David to take about 40 minutes or so, 45 minutes to share his work. And then we will invite discussants to come to the table and then share their thoughts, and have David respond to their thoughts, and then at some point, hopefully, we'll have enough time to have all of you also to share your thoughts and ask questions. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Ashok. And thanks to the India-China Institute and the New School for inviting me and for hosting me here. And there's a lot of people to thank. Chris, Christina, others at the Institute, but also yourselves for coming out this afternoon. And I hope that the ideas and images that we're working through over the next hour or so are of some interest to you. As Ashok mentioned, my background is as a geographer, professionally trained geographer, and a self-taught photographer. So I've been making a transition over the years from my photography serving my geography to my geography now serving my photography. And what I'd like to do this afternoon is, in a sense, blend these two in this presentation. When I learned that Ashok and Mark were going to join me this afternoon, I couldn't not begin my talk with this photograph. It has a certain Three Musketeers look that I just love. It was taken by Chris Radcliffe, another member of this small expedition that Ashok had put together this last summer. And Ashok is on the left here, Mark is in the center, and I'm on the right. And behind us is Mount Kailash. We were on a pilgrimage route walking around the mountain. But besides its, its entertainment value, there's something else that I want to mention about this photograph. We were all engaged in a joint reconnaissance of the Kailash area for possible academic and scholarly purposes, and we were also, each of us in our own way, involved in a pilgrimage of some sort. For myself, that included a final photograph that I had wanted to take for many years and was unable to take. In past attempts to reach Kailash, either because of political problems or bad weather. So this past summer, when Ashok invited me to join their group, it was a great opportunity. And it allowed me to get this last picture and really button up what, for me, was a 10-year project. And it was all leading towards this book, which I had put on hold when I realized I was going to be able to go to Kailash this summer, and I had the designer just hold a page and told him I'd be back with a picture of Kailash, and that kind of stalled everything considerably, but the book is going to come out in June or so. I think Ashok mentioned it. But let me begin with this photograph here. This is a photograph taken in Ladakh above Leh, Shanti Stupa, the Peace Pagoda. There's a couple of things about this photograph that interests me. One, as a photographer, just the formal aspects of the image, the spaciousness and the geometry and the composition and the light and that type of thing. But there's something else going on here. For one, the architecture is out of place. It belongs in a tea garden in Japan. It was one of many peace pagodas that have been built around the world by a group of people operating out of a monastery in Japan. So architecturally, the geography is wrong, but also, and more interesting for me, it overlooks a couple of things. It overlooks an Indian Army barracks, and it overlooks a contested geography. So there's a lot of geopolitical intrigue and tension that is viewed from this plaza of the Shanti Stupa. As a peace pagoda, I thought it was a great situation for this kind of an architectural structure. At the time I took that picture, I didn't have anything particular in mind. I was photographing places, not really connecting these places, but over time I did start to connect them, at least in my mind, around this loosely defined notion of a sacred geography, which is what I want to really talk about with you this afternoon. A couple of years later, on the other end of the Himalaya range, in the Kham region of eastern Tibet, is a lake called Yilhun Latso, where these mani stones, these scriptural carved stones, come up out of the lake. And it also was pleasing to me on a purely kind of aesthetic level, and formally for photography purposes, a very pleasing place. But it was also part of an attempt to connect my background in geography with my interest in photography in a more kind of formalized way. Coming out of geography, I've been for many, many years involved in imagery, geographical imagery. And much of this was geared towards developing empirical cartographies, the kind of map making that is rests in latitude and longitude coordinates that allows us to measure the surface of the Earth, locate places, make maps, measure areas, the kind of quantitative empirical studies that a lot of geographers do, and which I had done for much of my career. So the kind of map that you're looking at here is a map that we're all very accustomed to, and it is a map that's based on latitude, longitude coordinates, and it's something that's common to us, and we rely on these kinds of maps quite a bit. We can take this empirical information and work it through various softwares, really, computer-based softwares, and develop different ways of viewing that region. This, for example, is a digital elevation model of the Himalaya, which has about 20 layers of satellite imagery, building then an image of the Himalaya, which is actually accurate in terms of spatial coordinates and relationships and everything, but obviously a very different view. And when we take an image like this, we're really creating this kind of pixelated world, and if you zoom in on this, we're really dealing with captured energy that we're organizing then by bits, pixels, picture elements that we call this. So that background helps me understand a bit more, I guess, what I'm trying to do photographically in a project like Sacred Geography, where I'm dealing with not empirical maps, but mental maps. These are the maps that we hold in our minds that help us navigate the world and find our place in the world. And you know, these maps we develop as we experience the world. And these mental maps have various aspects to them, but it can also include this spiritual dimension, this spiritual aspect. So when I'm, as a geographer, and I wear both of these hats kind of simultaneously, as a geographer trained empirically in a kind of a quasi-objective approach to science, trying to distance myself to a certain degree from what I'm looking at simply doesn't work in this kind of study. How do you get inside a mind, for example? So in photography, there's a huge debate having to do with this idea of perspective and you know, who's holding the camera and to what purpose and so forth. And also, I'm interested in a landscape then that is not so empirically defined, but a landscape that is held in people's consciousness, and that, in fact, becomes imprinted in a way on the landscape. So it does become tangible. And it's that tangible aspect that then I felt I could capture photographically. And then I could begin to see, you know, the landscape as a sacred map itself. This is not my idea. I mean, this has been worked through centuries by many, many people. In this particular case, you're looking at a landscape map drawn by a person in Nepal who has formal training in religious paintings, tankas, but has recently moved into more figurative painting, primarily to serve a tourism market in Nepal, but in a sense capturing that kind of spiritual orientation of a landscape. So if we kind of imagine how that could be seen in a place, then we can start to see space being organized and demarcated in various ways. This is an archway onto a ceremonial ground near some mountains in Damchung County in Tibet, near Lake Namso, which is a sacred lake and a sacred set of mountains and actually sacred ceremonial ground. So in a way, here we have a gateway or a threshold between profane or secular space and sacred space, and these kinds of demarcations in the landscape have markers to them. So the approach that I would use as an empirical geographer based upon these kind of Cartesian coordinates, which allow us to organize the Earth's surface for purposes of quantitative study or measurement, have to, in a way, be replaced by other kinds of markers, and really defining ritual coordinates as opposed to latitude and longitude coordinates. So one of the things I felt I could photograph legitimately, I suppose, in my own mind, were some of these ritual, these markers that mark these ritual coordinates. And they take all kinds of forms. They could be cairns, they could be prayer flags, they could be sacred thresholds, various things that sort of organize space in a sense according to concepts of sacred geography. In this way, I'm working with the idea of sacred space, which again is something that's very old and very long-standing, particularly in this part of the world, and has already been represented in many ways. I mean, there's a long, long tradition of representing sacred space in paintings and in artwork, in terms of visuals, but also in other ways, in literature and various ways. What you're looking at here is a particular kind of a mandala. It's one that centers on Mount Meru, which is really a mythological mountain, a connector, the axis mundi connecting the earth and the empyrean symbolically. That's represented in this particular tanka. And this was from inside a temple complex in Bhutan, the Trongsa Dzong, which is this dzong right here. So that we have a building, which is an architectural structure built that then contains these, in a way, celestial markers or landscape markers. And these places then become important places for people in the organization of sacred space. Because I was interested in tangible features, photographically now, tangible features of what are essentially mental maps, and then using, markers in the landscape to help guide me to them. What I oftentimes found was that these took all kinds of forms, and they represented different traditions in the Himalaya Tibetan region, the main traditions of Hinduism and Buddhism, but also pre-Buddhist Bon traditions, most notably. What I want to do is organize this idea of sacred geography into some components and use some images to convey some ideas about some of these components. So in one sense, we can think about sacred geography as being marked by natural elements, where an earth-based spiritual tradition is using natural features in the landscape, not only to mark passage through sacred geography, but to, in a sense, tap into a sense, anyway, of earth energetics. And these kinds of landscape features then can be quite diverse. Rivers, for example, commonly. Very importantly, the source of rivers, but also the confluence of rivers, the flow that's contained within rivers. This is near the headwaters of the Ganges River. And these are the Bhagirathi peaks in the background. We're getting close here to the source of the Ganges, which is one of the important pilgrimage sites for people of Hindu tradition. And there are every year many, many pilgrims, spiritual travelers who follow this river up to the source of this particular river. So it could be a river like this. It could be a mountain itself, a summit. This is Shivling, associated with Shiva. And as a mountain summit, in some ways representative of this connector between earth and heavens, but also possibly associated with certain deities, the abode of deities, the abode of demons in some particular cases, but also in interesting kinds of ways, recognizing perhaps subliminally the idea of earth energy. The Himalaya is an active, tectonically active, seismically active place, and these mountains in the Himalaya lie in the main thrust zone of the Himalaya. And geographically, I've been kind of studying this stuff for many, many decades. But in this particular photography project I was involved in my own mind, making these kinds of connections between ideas of Earth and energy and the transmission of energy and the cycling of energy, and then how people situate themselves within these flows of energy is very interesting. And then at a certain point, this can be translated into ideas of spiritual energy. And then how do you, in a sense, intersect with these spiritual flows of energy? This is in a forest grove. It's a deity statue of Kali, but it in a sense, is capturing that notion of tapping into this notion of a divine or a spiritual energy that may be specific to a place, because it's a place where people have practiced a faith for a long time and have therefore, in a sense, made it holy, sanctified it through religious practice. And it may be some recognition of an energy that's emanating from a particular spot. So forest groves may be another kind of a natural feature that would be representative then of this connection between an earth-based spiritual tradition and actual places in the landscape. The idea of place itself is important in this way. The geographer Yifu Tuan came up with the term, or applied the term topophilia, to refer to a person or society's relationship to a place, a relationship that may be based upon love, maybe based upon fear, a love in the sense of a divine energy, a divine love emanating, flowing through the world, a place of fear of wrathful deities that need to be appeased, recognized. And so, in a way, places then are not abstract locations that can be determined through latitude and longitude coordinates. Places are realized through experience. And, you know, this is a cover of The Economist magazine, but we are all dealing with this in various ways in our own lives. And the notion of a sense of place is something that we respond to at various levels, emotionally, physically, in terms of our subsistence and well-being, but also in terms of our self-identity and who we are and how we move through this world. So when we're in a landscape that has no seeming boundaries to it, but in fact, it really does. It has all sorts of places that are known places within the traditions of people who reside in this part of the world, and that allows then a certain sense of comfort in knowing one's place in this sacred world of geography and otherwise. In some of these places, people have put great effort into marking them through architectures of all sorts, through statuary. This is the Maitreya Buddha in the Tikse Monastery in Ladakh. And these markers then become very, very important. In fact, they become, in a way, magnets. And they can also become repositories for deep human meaning. This is in the Alchi complex in Ladakh, which has some of the most extraordinary, exquisite in situ artwork in the world within the chapels and the monasteries of Alchi. So we have here a tremendous investment of human energy and human emotion, human creativity in a place, which then by virtue of that, in a sense, empowers that place and has empowered that place for a very, very long time. This is an image from Drak another one of these kinds of places. These are meditation caves, not too far from Lhasa, really. But they're associated with teachings, they're associated with meditation practices of saints, and it's a site of pilgrimage in Tibet. And if you look closely, you'll see dollar bills, not dollar bills, but rupee notes and Tibetan Chinese currency, all kinds of currency pinned to the rock wall. And you also find bullet holes because this area was also part of the onslaught of religious sites throughout Tibet associated with the Chinese occupation in Tibet and then later with the Cultural Revolution in China. So we have a contested place here historically, but it's a very active place. These are lived places. They're not empty places. They're not monuments to some past practice. They're current, they're alive places, but they do have a contested history in many cases. Places such as these become connected then in various networks. Networks, for example, that may involve pilgrimage, which is a physical movement of people from place to place. This man is en route to the Ganges headwaters, sadhus, pilgrims, very commonly throughout this region, traveling from place to place, sometimes with guidebooks in hand to spiritual places, sometimes acting on memory, oral tradition, asking questions along the way, that type of thing. But all of them, in one way or another, following a very, very long tradition of movement among and between various sacred places throughout the region. Now, in our experience, generally in the West here, and particularly in mine as a geographer, we have tremendous technologies that allow us to become very accurate in our calculation of space and our ability to quantify space and really move through space. I mean, we have now technologies that we're all very familiar with that we do this, so that in a sense, we are probably, this generation, are probably some of the most high-end technology users of space of any generation before us, but we may not understand it that well, but we certainly have devices that allow us to move through it, and in some cases, they get in the way. Every once in a while, we hear of that person who drives their car into a lake because their GPS unit said that there was a road there, even though in front of them they see there's a lake. It's quite amazing, but it actually happens. So, these technological arrangements, on the one hand, can help us certainly move through space much more accurately, because they are very distracting. There are other ways to do this, certainly, and in this project, I was exploring some of these. This is the map of the Sacred Road in the northern Yunnan province, in the far eastern part of the Tibet Plateau, which is a marker, a route marker, if you will. And in this way, these places are connecting locations that are deemed either auspicious due to some kind of divine energy, or places that have a historical importance to them. In pre-Buddhist Bon traditions, much of the Tibet Plateau was conceptualized as a demoness that really needed to be placated by locating temples in key places and then moving amongst those various religious sites, and in the process of doing that, essentially appeasing appeasing a deity. So in these kinds of movements, obviously satellites and GPS units won't help. So other markers are in play here. And these are the markers then that we can see in the landscape that help guide us. This was a large mani stone. A mani stone is a scriptural rock, basically in this case almost a billboard on a hill above the Zongchen Valley, which I could almost see it as a billboard. It was so profound in the landscape, almost saying, well, you've arrived. It's visible for about 20 to 30 miles down valley, so it's a very prominent feature. In some cases, they could be prayer flags that are located in specific spots for particular reasons. But these places, on the one hand, many of you in this room may well have been in this part of the world, I suspect, and we come across these a lot, and they're very commonplace, and they can be quite beautiful and part of a setting and part of a scenery, and all of that is fine, and they can also be understood then as kind of working together into a more of a cohesive spatial structure that would link itself to spiritual practice and ritual and systems of belief and so forth. This might be done through wandering minstrels, in this case, in the Phuntsholei Valley, where religious histories are really transferred from community to community through song, for example, or through oral history, or through folklore. There's all kinds of ways that this might be done through the transmission of religious teachings, certainly. So these various means of connecting places help to kind of not only anchor these places in a larger sense of a sacred geography, but in effect create a sacred geography. It's actually that circulation that is creating these systems, in my view. And so the pilgrims who are traveling these routes, regardless of intention, because they would have various intentions, in fact are reaffirming the existence of this sacred space. in various ways. And then the gathering of pilgrims at key places, key monasteries, key times, festivals found throughout the region are again kind of reaffirming this. And this is where a lot of the sharing that's happening amongst and between people. Ideas are being transmitted, not only from person to person, but also from generation to generation. We were having a discussion earlier today with Ashok and Mark and a couple of other folks about kind of the intergenerational aspect of this whole business, and whether, you know, for young people today, any of this makes sense, and to what extent it does make sense, how it gets incorporated into their own emerging mental maps and sacred geographies. And you know, if there is anything that will speak to a sustainable future in this part of the world, it will be partly that. So that kind of intergenerational transmission is vital in this kind of a context here. And then, you know, the notion of change itself, transformation, dissolution, you know, this is all part and parcel to specifically the religious traditions of this part of the world, but to life in general. So change is ongoing, and it's not to be stopped. So how does this notion of change get incorporated into it? In some cases through, you know, an egregious history of bombing and exploding monasteries, and, you know, the kind of associations that we relate to Tibet and the occupation of Tibet by the Chinese, and the kind of the ignorance that's displayed when sacred entities, sacred places are wantonly destroyed. You know, you go in Tibet and you wander around the landscape and you see ruins everywhere, and they look like they're hundreds and hundreds of years old, and most of them are 50 years old or 60 years old, 70 years old at max. So you know, this can be a kind of an exaggerated extreme version. It also happens piece by piece. This is actually in Kathmandu Valley, very, you know, if those of you who have been to Kathmandu, it's a densely populated, modern urban setting, and the Pashupatinath temple is one of the most important places in the valley for all kinds of reasons. But above the main temple in the river are other smaller places, and many of them are deteriorating and falling apart, and kind of the woods, the forest is taking them back over. This image, though, is kind of interesting. I took this quite a number of years ago with that thought in mind, and then this last summer, I was in Kathmandu, and I went back to this spot, and the whole thing was gone, and they were rebuilding entirely a new structure on the spot. So, you know, these things these places are recycled in a certain kind of a way. They're kind of recycled in the minds of people, and they're physically recycled through architecture and engineering and so forth. This is a kind of a different way to think about this. We saw an image earlier about the source of or going up towards the source of the Ganges, the Bhagirathi River, and this is up at the source. What you're looking at here is the Gangotri Glacier, the snout of the glacier, and that ice cave, that darkened spot, up kind of midway up the slide on your left, is where one of the tributaries of the Ganges is gushing out from, and it's quite a spectacular spot. If you've ever been there, it draws a lot of people. I remember when I was up there photographing this. It was an especially interesting day. The light was just perfect. You know, this is a black and white image, but it was a colorful place. It was a brilliant blue sky, and the light was green and blue, and inside the cave was sadhu with kind of smoky dreads, where it was sitting on an iced boulder. It was just a spectacular color scene. But an interesting thing about this is that this source of the Ganges is retreating year by year, so even it isn't the same. This is a map showing the retreat of the Gangotri Glacier, which was one of the fastest receding glaciers in the Western Himalaya. And the dates that you're looking at are the dates in the end-terminal moraine, the end of the glacier, to its current position, and then back in time. And a temple that was built to represent this place, the Gangotri Temple, now is a couple of days' walk away from the actual glacier and the actual source itself. So it's basically been retreating uphill for quite some time, but it's picking up speed. It's moving backwards faster. And geologists are studying this retreat quite carefully. In other ways, it happens because things change around these places. Urbanization proceeds and temples become engulfed. And, on the one hand, this doesn't necessarily diminish their significance or importance for people at all, but it does remove them from view a bit. This is something that I've been thinking about quite some time, because in a way, if we're dealing with a map that it's in our mind that depends upon markers in the landscape, when those markers disappear, we can start to lose direction. We can start to lose our sense of where we are in this world. And so when these cultural markers change or disappear, there is the possibility of consequence in terms of the formation of these mental maps. And then the function and purpose of places may change, or there may be additional functions and purposes add on. There's an accretion that happens. This is a very important place in the Kathmandu Valley, a great stupa, Bodhana stupa. And if you look at, I should have actually put a photograph from 1962 that I have in a black and white photograph, where it was the most prominent feature in the valley. And now it's hard to see it anymore, unless you're on the third or fourth floor of the Hyatt Hotel. I think you have a great view. But on the other hand, it's still a magnet. I mean, it's an enormously populated, incredibly important spot, so that it's not diminished at all in that way. But there are a lot of other ways that people also experience this particular site, apart from any kind of a necessarily spiritual experience of it. So in some ways of thinking, this notion of space that's engaged with, I guess, an idea of sacred geography, we also have to think about time, especially the intergenerational notion of sacred geography. And what you're looking at here are two images about the same age, same number. One is a group of young monks in Wawar Monastery in eastern Tibet, and the other are a group of kids at a monastery in Kathmandu. And these kids on the right are hip urban young kids in Kathmandu. But they come to this monastery in the morning and they circumambulate this small monastery and they have a cup of tea and then they get on their motorbikes and they go to work. So, and I was talking to these kids, and it's a very important part of their life. They're not monks. They're not devoting their entire life to religious study, but this is an important place for them. And obviously the people on the guys on the left from the Wara Monastery, they're investing much of their life in one of these monastery settings. This photograph is a mountain called Kawagebo, which is in the northern Yunnan province, part of really on the eastern edge of the Tibet Plateau, but it's a part of an area that the Chinese have designated as Shangri-La. And it's really an anchor of Shangri-La. And it's a beautiful mountain. It's one of the holy peaks of Tibet, and it's a place of circumambulation, of pilgrimage. So it's been an important place for a very, very long time. And in Shangri-La, it kind of assumes the role of Mount Karakul, which shows up in the book by James Hilton called Lost Horizon, and also a film by James Hilton called Lost Horizon. And in this book, James Hilton introduced the term Shangri-La. And the Chinese have used this idea of Shangri-La to develop this region for tourism purposes primarily, and have actually, in the initial conception of Shangri-La as a real place in China for tourism, had actually employed geographers to locate natural features that most closely coincided with features that appeared in James Hilton's book. And Mount Karakul was one of those places in the Yubeng Valley associated with Shangri-La Valley itself. So it's kind of an interesting example of how at a whole level of society and economic development one could take generalized notions of sacred space, link those to much wider conceptions of geography, what I refer to as a geographical imagination, in this case based upon a particular piece of literature, a book called Lost Horizon, and then transform that into something that becomes a destination for hundreds of thousands, I think probably millions, I'm not sure, of tourists who are visiting every year. So it's a major resource for China. So this is what I have to say about sacred geography. And thank you very much. And I know that Ashok has some discussants to contribute to it. So thanks a lot.
Discussants to come, please. Join David.
Should I sit down here?
Yeah, why don't you sit down here? One thing that I forgot to mention is if you want to see David's photographs, there is an exhibit that is on display on the 4th floor. If you just go down one floor and then there's a sky bridge. If you walk, on the sky bridge, they are beautiful. I forgot, I think 12 or 13 photographs. So I would encourage you all to, find time to enjoy those photographs, and that will be on display until this Wednesday. So now let me invite first Mark Larrimore to share his thoughts.
Great, thank you very much.
And then Dominique, and then Siddiq. So I think I've already introduced all three of them, so I'll let them go.
David, thank you so much. It was a joy to be taken back to these places, some of which I learned to see through the black and white pictures that were being taken when we were traveling together. And it's true rarely now that one sees this area in black and white in the present. I think part of the way in which we understand this area is through black and white pictures from the past and colored pictures from the present, which then somehow or other extrapolate into a future that's either in fluorescent colors or perhaps no colors at all. And there's something disruptive and healing about black and white photographs from this present, I think, that both brings the pastness back to us, but also gives a more hopeful sense of the future and talks about some of those, or illustrates some of those processes that you described of transformation, dissolution, recycling. I don't really have questions. I guess I have one observation and then another observation, but I'll keep them brief because there are many people here and I'm sure many people would like to share their views. So the first observation, I guess, is just on this question about transformation and dissolution and the different kinds of maps. Oh, I forgot to mention also there's something absolutely wonderful about the way in which you braided different kinds of mappings together. Things from the physical and natural sciences, from the social sciences, things that many of us in the humanities get very tense over because we don't really know how to master these sorts of images. And then other kinds in which we feel quite at home. But there's a confidence in the way in which you interweave them that, again, is very, invites people to make a home in this landscape production, transfer, tradition. So I guess one observation would be that a number of these representations, a number of these mappings are at odds with each other. And it's not just that there's a contrast between what we see now and what will have been there before, or perhaps between what people think they're seeing and what is no longer there. And we tend to mark that story through images of the devastation of a Tibetan cultural landscape, represented as somehow timeless by the very specific historical event of the Chinese invasion. And I wonder if that isn't a little bit too easy, if maybe landscapes are always contested, and these markers aren't just ways of reminding ourselves or projecting a shared sense of the world onto the world which we share with each other, but also ways of claiming landscapes away from another. And for those of you who are familiar with the representation of Tibet as the pinning down or the appeasing of a demoness, there's really no better representation of the way in which mapping is itself actually a contestatory political intervention. And part of what's interesting to me that I've learned from this project that the Luce Foundation and the India-China Institute and your work among others, David, have sort of opened up to me, is how the Himalaya manages somehow or other to accommodate a number of what might otherwise seem to be incompatible maps. And that's just an observation. The way in which you layered this sort of triggers this for me, but I think there's also a danger that we fall too quickly into the sense that there is a single shared, if deep and rich, world. The other observation, more from a sort of a theoretical perspective as a scholar of religion, going back to the very first thing you mentioned, how it is that in your career you've moved from having your photography serve your geography to now being at a point in which your geography is serving your photography. I found that both incredibly eloquent and I found it to resonate with some of the most incisive critiques within the study of religion, of ways of talking about religion that mystify something that really doesn't need to be mystified. And in particular, a critique that's been made for about 15 years now of the category of pure experience, which says that, well, the really heart of every experience is ineffable. It cannot be represented. Any representation in words, in images, in performances, any of those sorts of things will inevitably cheapen the experience. And that's something that's built into the rhetoric of a particular conception of religion, which lets religion then be this point you can use to sort of map things on top of other people's realities. And the form that this critique usually takes is that, well, all we have is what's visible. All we have is what's demonstrable, what's empirical. But if we looked at it, we would realize that everything we need is there. And I think if I wanted to make that point visually, I couldn't do better than to show people the slides that we just saw. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That really was a pleasure. You know, I too have spent a lot of time in this part of the world, and so it really is a pleasure to see such beautiful images. I think one of the one sort of aspect of your presentation that really struck me. Actually, I just came from the Rubin Museum where we were I was looking with some friends at images of Buddhist protector deities, right? These sort of very fierce looking. Oh, sure. Yeah, is that better? Thank you. Okay. I was looking at the Rubin Museum at some images of what are often called protector deities or protectors, these very kind of fierce looking Buddhist images that are terrifying, that are often very closely associated with particular aspects of the Tibetan landscape, like mountains or rivers or and the friend that I was talking to told me that a few years ago a Tibetan Lama in New York had told him that, oh, you know, all the protectors have left New York, you know, so you're on your own now, basically, that those powerful kind of forces and energies that are at play in that are so alive in the Tibetan landscape, or in the Himalayan landscape, let's say more broadly, are sort of, you know, given up on us. So, you know, we all sort of laughed and walked on to the other images in the museum. But in looking, especially in looking at the image where you talked about the sort of different layers of the sort of sediment, right, of the ground, and you sort of see the Tibetan basement up to the Tibetan plateau. I just sort of, I was struck by that idea that the kind of the earth, that these forces that Tibetans or Himalayans often think of as the spirits, right, the sort of spirit of the earth, which in many ways is very timeless in that part of the world, right? Young people, and your comment about whether young people are sort of still connected to these ideas, I have often found that they really are, you know, that this sort of, you can be an absolutely modern, you know, someone with very contemporary tastes and have a really kind of cosmopolitan global worldview, and still really have a sense, you know, if I pee on that rock, I'm going to get a rash on my skin, because the rock the world around us is animated in this way that is absolutely real. And so I guess one of my main observation, again, not so much a formal question, but something I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on, is about the way that your presentation made me think about sort of I guess the sort of inadequacy of our separation sometimes between, you know, the past and the present in terms of how we relate to our geography. You know, I should have said actually that the comment in the Rubin Museum came out of someone saying, there's a sinkhole in front of my house. And I said, and they're repairing it. And I said, oh, that's so funny. Yesterday I was in Brooklyn. He was talking about Harlem. I said, in Brooklyn, I was walking along and our block, you know, near our house was cordoned off because of a sinkhole, you know, and the sort of sense that the Earth is talking back, right? That there's this sort of active force of the world, which we don't tend to think of as the sort of spirit of New York, the protectors of New York talking back to us about our choices. But in some way, your talk made me think about, you said that maybe this is a subliminal response to the tectonic plates in these places. This is a PowerPoint. But somehow I think it might be interesting to bring that kind of thinking into the way we relate even to a place like New York. And in some ways, it might not be so far off from how we understand the world that's around us already. So thanks so much.
Thank you, David. And I really want to begin with your first photograph of Shanti Stupa. And being from Ladakh, I always felt there was something wrong whenever I looked at the Shanti Stupa, and it never struck me that it was actually the architecture. And the fact that a Japanese architecture was really out of place, in that. And so thank you for pointing that out. I don't know how many years I've gone back again and again to it. I also want to thank you because it brought back a memory, which was quite amazing. I grew up for the first few years of my life in Lhasa, as I was telling you a little bit earlier. And so the first time I went there as a conscious adult was many, 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 many years later. And I remember going to Lhasa and then to the Holy of Holies of Tibetan Buddhism. And for the first time, I felt power, with a place. And felt an incredible urge to prostrate and fall down, which I didn't do. And it was the more remarkable because I'm a Muslim. And this was a Buddhist site. And so it explains a lot of things. And I think that we have, of course, lost our sense of nature. All religions, Islam included, talk about the importance of nature. And in fact, Islam refers to nature. Refers to nature as being the first book and the most important of books for learning. And we've lost touch, I think, and the kind of thing that you're doing, I think, bringing the scientific along with ruminations of the mind and meditations, I think are very important. And I hope it continues. Thank you.
Thank you all three of you. David, would you like to?
Yeah, I'll just very quickly, I'll try to respond to all of them at once. I live in a little holler in Kentucky, and I've been there for about 27 years. And we farm, and we cut firewood, and we heat with a wood stove. And when I go to the Himalaya in Tibet, I'm a visitor. And this project was a great excuse to go to some very exquisite places. And while I'm generally receptive to the notion of a spiritual energy, I also realize that that's not something that just comes, that's a result of a lot of work. It may be the result of a bloodline. It may be the result of a long history. But I do know that living where I do in Kentucky, and I'm not from Kentucky either, I'm also one of these people, I'm not quite sure where I'm from. But I do know that the longer that I stay in the place where I live and the harder I work in that place on the land, the more connected I am to that place. And I think this is true for everybody, and it doesn't require necessarily anybody going anywhere. And New York City is just a fine place to do that. So that's one thing I would say. And the other thing I guess I would say is that as a geographer, I have been trained to see the landscape as a reflection of humanity, that it's a reflection of our intentions, conscious or otherwise, the way that we design the places where we live, the transformations that take place as our lives change and as the world changes around us, these become registered in the landscape. And so the landscape is a beautiful tool of inquiry for me. And it has been all through my career as a geographer, and it is now in terms of my photography. So I guess that's what I have to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm sure there are a lot of questions. We do have microphones, and I just want to make sure that people know that we are recording this special event. So please speak, to the mic so that we can record it properly. And also, please identify yourself. Just say who you are, so it would be helpful.
My name is Hugh McGuire. I apologize for my voice. I thought the presentation was really fascinating. I have basically two questions that I'd like to just throw to you. Most Asian people that I have encountered have told me that their comprehension of Buddhism is cultural, whereas my comprehension of Buddhism is intellectual. And I probably have a much deeper understanding of the intellectual content of Buddhism than they do, but they have a much more profound emotional connection to the culture of Buddhism. So I wonder if you could speak to that, because that relates to the second thing, and that is magic. I think many of these pilgrims are going on these journeys to the mouth of the Ganges or whatever to receive magical benefits. Christians, the Catholics have places like Lourdes and similar places where people go and they think they're going to be healed. And I suspect there is that dimension that influences the attitude of people in conducting these things. And then basically the third is that so much of, the Buddha, his original first disciples were the children of the nobles. And I think in many respects, Buddhism has continued that way through the centuries, that there's a social class distinction of the people who are become the monks and the monasteries. And I was wondering if you had looked into that. Thank you, David.
Thank you. I'm not a religious scholar, folks. I'm a geographer and a photographer. And my knowledge of Buddhism is primarily a visual one, interestingly enough. I mean, in the sense that I don't delve deeply into the liturgical or scriptural content of Buddhism. I have tried to learn along the way a certain amount of core teachings. And those aren't for any other reason than that they may help me personally. I have no professional claim or really any professional interest in kind of explaining anything. Frankly, actually, let me go back to why I said I've switched from my photography serving my geography to my geography serving my photography, because I'm less interested in explaining and more interested in evoking. So that when I work visually, it's really just to give an image to someone, maybe a little bit of content or context to think about that image, but then to allow them to think about it in their own terms, according to their own knowledge. And all of us have very different knowledge bases about this subject. And so I suspect we're all reacting to them very differently. Some of them may be just reacting to it on a purely aesthetic level, and some of us may be, the kinds of inquiries that you have that are a little bit deeper, that have to do with some of the meaning coming out of the experience of Buddhism or the practice of Buddhism. But I really can't answer those questions in any meaningful way, I think, that would contribute or help clarify anything. I just want to kind of put out there as transparent as I can where I'm coming from. And it's not that I'm diminishing any of that, it's just that I'm not privy to it, and I'm not familiar with it enough to even speak on it, which, one could look at me as a bit of a fraud for taking on a topic like this. But on the other hand, I really don't have any particular claim to doing what I'm doing beyond what I'm simply laying out there and giving it to people to do what they want as far as the imagery. So if the images have kind of sparked a couple of questions in your mind, I suspect you're going to think about those questions much more than I am. But thank you very much for raising them, and there's probably other people in the room who could help out a lot more.
Okay, before we go, I think, would you like to comment, any one of you, on the question regarding, the intellectual and the experiential? It's an important question, so please, yeah.
Sure. If I just to make sure I understood you, you were saying that in conversation with people who are sort of from Buddhist cultures, that their take is that your view as a kind of, say, a Western someone who's curious about Buddhism. I'm sorry, I don't know your background, but if you're studying Buddhism, that it's more of an intellectual. I mean, to me, I guess.
Their experience is culture.
Oh, right. Yes. Yeah.
They make that distinction, and many have made that distinction with me, so I can
Sure.
assume that it means something.
Sure.
What does it mean?
Well, I mean, I think that it partly. I mean, certainly in the Tibetan context, let's say, Buddhism is pervasive through, social more, how to conduct yourself in a conversation, what hand you use to hand someone something, what kind of gestures are considered polite and not polite, that there's all kinds of ways of speaking, that it's really pervasive, right? So that in that sense, it's cultural. But it sounds like you're saying something kind of deeper than that in terms of the kind of emotional element or it's a kind of more integrated.
As to what it means is that it has less to do with the intellectual principles of Buddhism or Hinduism or what have you, or Islam.
Sure.
And much more to do with the magical dimension.
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah, thanks. Wonderful.
By going to the mouth of the Ganges, you're going to achieve something.
Okay. I see. Okay, yeah, wonderful. So it is correct. As you said, it connects directly to your second question. Actually, my sort of first response to your second question is actually it's much more than magic. There is magic in pilgrimage in the Himalayan world, but there's also trade. People do sell and buy things along the way. They, have other families outside of their hometown. They, on pilgrimage routes, they study, they bring objects of interest from other cultures, and it's entertainment, right? I mean, pilgrimage is also has a very profound and expansive social function and magic is also there, but it's one of the elements in this, I think, very, very rich kind of broad social experience of pilgrimage that also incorporates learning about history and having an identity that's connected both to the geography and to the historical context of the place. Remembering your ancestors' passage through those similar kind of locations. So I think magic is also there, definitely. But to me, that's one element in this otherwise very complex and rich kind of phenomenon of pilgrimage, right? And then in terms of whether it's intellectual or kind of something more emotional or experiential, I think you might say the same thing about every religion, right? That most people who practice religion are not scholars of that religion. They may have some interest in the philosophy. They might not. And I'm not about to say they're not a good, Catholic or Buddhist because they're not studying the philosophy. So I think that might be partly what they're saying. A kind of modesty of saying, I don't start asking me about philosophy because that's not what I do. Might be part of it as well.
Thank you. Siddiq, you want to just, and then I'll
the question made a story, a Tibetan parable, spring to mind, and that was that a man once set off for pilgrimage to India because that's where all the holy spots of Buddhism are, and en route he was told by his mother that he should bring back a relic of some sort. So the man went and had a grand time in India, went to all the Buddhist spots. And then on the way back, coming across the mountains, he suddenly remembered that he was supposed to bring home a relic, and he hadn't brought it. So he picked up a dog's tooth that he saw and took it back home to the village and said, "This is the tooth of the Buddha." and they enshrined it and started to worship it and to pay obeisance to it, and pretty soon it started to shine, and stuff. So I mean, therefore, just to answer the question of the material versus the intellectual, the theoretical versus the academic, versus the practice itself, is that the magic is in the confluence of practice and theory. And in the West, we're used to the theory, and in the East, we're used to the practice. With honorable exceptions, of course. And so I think that, and in each society, the same thing happens. So I think that the attempt in religions as a whole is the confluence of the two. That's where the magic happens.
Thank you. I think I know there are many, many hands, going up. So what we will do is I would ask people to be brief in their, whatever comments or questions they're asking, and then we will take maybe 3 questions at a time. That way, we'll cover, and then we'll go 2-3 rounds. We have time. So please identify yourself, Toshi.
Yeah. My name is Toshi Tanaka. I'm a Japanese Buddhist, and I work for UNDP. I work in Myanmar, Bhutan, also Pakistan recently. There is a kind of two spirituality. In fact, a human being not necessarily for having natural spirituality. There are a lot of natural power, we believe, that come from mountain, big mountain, old trees, and maybe animals. And so they have its own power. So you have natural spirituality and the human spirituality. And then why Buddhism, in this case, is found both locations because they love isolations, all right? They vanish from the human world, then go into spiritual world where no one comes, where their spirituality can deepen itself, and then where they can identify a more maybe closer to where they want to be, like nirvana. So in a way, I think you are seeing the mixtures of natural spirituality and human spirituality where I think Buddhists want to symbolize over there. So whatever they create there, it kind of create, create a kind of synergy between the nature and what their architectures are. That's why I think it's mutually enhancing. I don't have much question, but I feel very sad in Pakistan, for example, Gandhara and all those places are becoming ruins. Then become only natural spirituality, even that kind of being lost, and human spirituality lost. Then, kind of sacred geography is being affected by also disturbance of religion, disturbance of human spirituality, conflict in a way. So that's kind of things I just want to present as a kind of issues if you want to look at.
Thank you. 2 more questions. Charles here, and then I'll come to the second. Toshi, yeah. All right. Yeah. Two questions from that end, and then I'll take the second round. Charles, please.
Hi, I'm Charles Zerner, and I teach environmental studies up at Sarah Lawrence. And I've got just a few things to say. One is simply a comment, which is I want to thank you very much for beautifully complex, multi-layered, contradictory presentation that brings in, it's like listening to tectonic plates slide under each other. If you don't mind the geomorphological, geophysical metaphor, you've really, you haven't woven you've described some other kind of physical process. It was great. Thank you. Here are my 2 comments or questions. The first one is this. One of the, I may say, shocking things about your presentation was the revelation not only that Lost Horizons, of course, gave rise to a Chinese initiative to create a tourist site, but even worse than that, or felicitously, the notion that a book could then create the psychic and geographical grounds for creating yet another layer of pilgrimage with Western tourists cycling in, paying for their flights, paying for their quasi-Tibetan food, and doing some form of worship. It's a form of globalized religiosity. Adds a dizzying level of complexity to your lovely presentation of, authentic Tibet and then post-invasion Tibet. Okay, that's the comment. Shock. The other question is directed more to Professor Larrimore, because I was somewhat disturbed by your analysis of Professor Zurick's presentation when you said that, indeed, even the notion of the goddess being transposed onto the landscape of the Nepali plateau was a form of a political contestation. And the question that I have for you is it all turtles all the way down? But wait a moment, isn't this the kind of postmodern view from nowhere, no position, it's all just perspectival? And where does that leave us if we want places to put our orientation on our ground? That's my challenge to you.
Thank you, Charles. One more, enough, and then we will let them respond.
Hi, my name is Monica. And thank you so much. I very much appreciate your approach to your work. It feels really you're not analyzing it, you're presenting it. I very much appreciate that. It evoked a lot of thoughts in me because sacred landscape, what is it? Is it just the landscape, nature itself? Does it include cities, people, probably all of it, because we have political landscape, we have nature landscape, and probably urban landscape too. I myself grew up in a tiny village of 200 people, and where my family has lived there probably for 500 or 1,000 years, and on a farm, and so every hill, every field had its name, had its meaning. There were all these different spirits, and then I lived in places like Tokyo, Mumbai, New Delhi, Ireland, New York, different places, and I traveled. I went on pilgrimages, and I think what it evoked isn't any landscape sacred? Doesn't every place on this planet has a meaning and spirits that inhabit it or energies that it originally has? And isn't it the religions that then used certain places for their own, I wouldn't say profit, but for their own means? They put their Mother Mary, Kali, into these places that people before religion even existed worshipped as a special place in nature. I know that, like, where I grew up, there were the Romans, there were the Celts, and then the Catholics, and so I kind of grew up with all these different, with witchcraft, all these different things that happened simultaneously, actually. That's why I think it's not particular in one part of the world only. I think, and then just one more comment. Then I was thinking, what about urban landscape, sacred urban landscape? If I meet young kids, let's say 18 years old, and this kid takes me into his favorite or her favorite club, isn't that also their place where they receive energy? Isn't that also a sacred place? I think we tend to be very critical and demonize modern culture and the cities, and yes, maybe originally they were built according to sacred geometry, and maybe it doesn't quite fit, but doesn't each generation, each city, each place have its own sacredness? It doesn't have to be a mountain or river or something else. So.
Thank you. David?
Well, the short answer is yes. I mean, in my opinion. And I don't think there's anything exceptional about the Himalaya or Tibet in this regard. And I think part of in my thinking about things like sacred geography, to the degree that one in their own mind comprehends or not some sort of divine energy in the world, I guess is up to each of us individually. But I do believe that there are places that we go to that allow us to get outside of the normal conventions of our life, that free our mind in certain ways. And these don't need to be the Tibet Plateau. They could well be a corner of a room or a park in New York City. So yes, I believe they're everywhere, and it really is a human consciousness that we're really talking about here, in either in the recognition of some divine energy or in the creation of divine energy, quite frankly, by sanctifying places, by practicing a form of faith in a place. So yes, I think you're right, and I would imagine they could be anywhere that we want them to be, including here.
David, you earlier?
Oh, was there another question? Oh, was there another question?
Yes.
Okay.
I think we'll wait. I think maybe Mark, then you.
Oh,
can.
Mark, yeah.
Just a few words about turtles all the way down.
That's okay.
In some sense, well, yes, obviously everything is turtles. In some sense, yes, obviously everything is turtles all the way down. We are turtles. In another way, I guess I'd say that if we didn't have access through things like David's work to the lived experience of actual people, we'd be reduced to nothing but endless escalators of turtles. And I mean that not in a flip way, but in a very serious way, that a landscape like Tibet that can be represented as the placation or the taming or the conquest of an earlier set of energies could be represented in a very violent way if we don't enter it, if we don't know what it's like. But one of the things that I found when I got to spend a little bit of time in this region is that things that seem contradictory at the intellectual level, like these people couldn't live together with these people in this space, or these people couldn't possibly abide this particular set of practices along with these others. When you go there, you find that in fact there they are, as the philosopher Leibniz said, the possible, the actual defines the possible. So what actually happens shows you something about what's possible that you might not have been able to figure out theoretically. So there's an incredible contribution made by the kind of evocative work that David's photographs represent that show us possibilities that we might not actually be able otherwise theoretically to fathom.
I think to answer your question regarding isn't all of nature sort of powerful and I agree with that. But I think we have to be careful when we start talking about urban sacred spaces and so forth, and I think that there is a distinction between two kinds of sacred spaces. For example, I mean, I can be in New York, I can be at the Empire State Building, and I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm in New York, and that's that. I can be in the Himalaya, or I can be in the Alps, or I can be in the Andes, or I can be in the middle of an ocean or a desert, and suddenly feel, by looking at a certain aspect of nature, that I'm at the center of the universe. I think that's the distinction between the two, and I think that we need to make that distinction, or if not need, I mean, is that felt or not is a question that is very much out on the table.
Mm-hmm.
May I say something? I just wanted to comment also on the demoness, the supine demoness that is Tibet, which is just such a fascinating aspect, I think, of Tibetan Buddhism and also the violence in some ways of the history of Buddhism in Tibet, that it is a story of domination, right? I mean, it's a story of the earth itself in Tibet is understood as this fierce, wild demoness, this power that needs to be pinned down. And it's pinned down, it's a woman also, which we can also talk about that, but it's a woman that needs to be pinned down by Buddhist monuments. And this tension never goes away. The idea that Tibetan space is fierce and wild, and Tibetans themselves even use words like barbaric about it, right? That the sense that it's fierce and alive, and that it's in this ongoing, this never-ending conversation with Tantric Buddhism that it's tamed and brought, but not like brought into submission and then killed, but but living, and that the tension between the wildness and untamedness of the landscape, of the earth, and of the spirit of the place is in this fruitful tension endlessly with Tibetan Buddhism, you know, and it's layered with the history of domination too, because those temples really were, or at least the mythic history is that it was Sonsan Gampo's wife, his Chinese wife, who brought the knowledge of geomancy to Tibet and brought the images that would then pin down that demoness, right? So we do have these wonderful layers of contestation and domination, and then really fruitful kind of ongoing interactions, right? That's in some ways, like one of my favorite impressions about Tibetan Buddhism is this sense of the activity of the landscape. The fact that the landscape needs to be tamed is also what makes it the perfect place for Tantric Buddhism, if you see what I mean from the Tibetan point of view, right?
Thank you. The lady there, and then gentleman here, and three people.
Thank you. My name is Liz, and I'm deeply grateful for your images. I find myself really thinking about the receding glacier and also the changing source of the Ganges, and then of the temple that is no longer right there at the source, but several days' journey away. And it set up for me a kind of a feeling of great loss and sadness. Also, I thought, well, so what is the sacred story that gets told now? You know, where is the earth energy now? Where is the sacred place now? Has there been a kind of a movement? Is all of it the sacred place? And how is that being thought about? And I wondered if a different story is being told because of the way that the earth is changing.
Just hold on. Let's take a couple of questions. Yes.
Okay. So I don't even
Yeah.
unless you want me
Yeah, I think so. It would be because we are recording it.
Sure.
Yeah, we are recording it. Yeah, gentlemen.
So you do wonderful work, and it speaks for itself. And my question really is about the fact that you clearly went into this exercise, as you've clarified, without sort of trying to put too much of an intellectual lens on it, and you've succeeded. But as you were doing it, were there local people that felt that perhaps you weren't? And how did you reassure them that you, in fact, were there to celebrate this and not to deconstruct it? And in doing that, did you at times, or were you at times tempted to show them your work as demonstration of the fact that you appreciated the...
Thank you. Okay, I think we'll do one more round, so I will come to you in the next
Okay.
round. Just two questions, yeah, please. Just wait for the next round. Yeah. David, please.
Okay, these are two great questions. I can answer them at the same time. And I'll answer it this way. The backstory with the Gangotri Glacier and the Gangotri Temple is this. The high priest of the Gangotri Temple joined me on the walk up to the source, and he was very interested in photography. So his was a personal hobby of his. So we were connecting on the photography end of things, but as we walked for several days together up to the source, he was explaining the mountain winds as the breath of Shiva, and I was talking about adiabatic lapse rates, and we were talking about this and that, and there were boulders along the course of the riverbank where the geologists had marked the end moraine of the glacier in 1933 and 1957. So he was asking me about this, and then I was talking about climate change and recession of glaciers throughout the Himalaya. And then I asked him, what does this mean for Hinduism if the Gangotri Glacier disappears? And he just looked at me and shrugged his shoulders, and this is the age, of Kali. what can one expect? And it was an interesting response. We really didn't even pursue it beyond then. It was just this notion of change and transformation and dissolution, which is a very accepting way of looking at the world. So the questions that we might have about what does this mean for Hinduism really didn't seem to be a pressing concern. So the first question specifically, that was kind of the background to that particular situation. But in terms of connecting with people and what they thought about it, it was an example of one interaction among many, many, where I was kind of working through my work photographically, and then also, because it's tied to geography, my geographical studies, and exploring their place, me as a visitor and them as a resident, and being very clear about that. I was a student in their place, and I was kind of learning about it. And I photograph with a large format camera, so there's no hit and run photography involved here. You're immediately the center of attention. And in fact, when you photograph with a large format camera, everything revolves around you. So it's not like you're hiding, And so what I thought initially is that this was going to create a barrier between myself and whatever it is I was interested in taking an image of. But in fact, it was quite the opposite, that it's an engaging process. That once you engage with, if it's an individual, for example, with a landscape that no people, it makes no difference. But when there's people involved, particularly if it's a portraiture kind of a thing, then once they come to an understanding of what it is that you're seeing, and this is a beautiful process, by the way, and it's the most rewarding process, in fact, that then you're colleagues in this endeavor. And then you may get a good image. Without that, you're not going to get it. It's not going to happen anyway, and you might as well just pack it up and go home, because it really isn't going to happen. So that's, great. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Rubin Allen. I'm a visiting student here. And well, first I'll preface by just telling you a little bit about myself. I used to work at an investment bank, and before that, I had been a Vaishnava, which is a devotee of Vishnu. And one thing that I really thought about a lot, just listening to everyone talking, is how, like someone was saying before, every culture is inextricably rooted to its geography, topography, or some people would say geomancy. And that there's been this focus, like on how holy certain spots are. Like, for instance, the Himalayas is, said to be the result of this crashing of one continent into another, hence the term subcontinent. But I think a lot of people forget that, like someone was saying before about the holiness of even a place like New York. New York lies on a fault line, so what does that mean? Is there something special about this place? But kind of going forward on that whole idea of sacred places, one thing that really struck me about being in and visiting India was the kind of mindset toward arriving at a place. You'll notice that when you go to Vrindavan or Tibet, there are no helipads. You just can't arrive there, It's a lot about, taking one of those motorcycle taxi cabs and then getting to the place where, where you're going to get on the back of a mule or a yak, and then you're going to walk for a very long time. And I met someone. I was recently doing a thing down in Atlanta, a business thing, and I met someone named Nasi, and I looked up the name, and it said to separate. And then, and this name, it means priest, but it means to separate. And then I was looking up the meaning of the word sacred, or to sanctify, and that means to separate as well. And I was thinking, well, that's a part of the whole idea of something being holy, that you can't necessarily get to it so easily. You have to walk, and you have to crawl, and you have to roll up 10,000 steps, and all that is a part of setting the mood for arriving at a sacred place. And I was wondering, just I don't think no one really touched on the politics of the area, but what does it mean when you have one country or another trying to claim a place that by definition is separate from everywhere else? That's particularly what makes it special, and what effect does that have, not just on the land masses, but the mentality of the people who are trying to interpret, what it means to live in a place.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes. last question, then I think we'll move on.
Hi, I'm Kathleen, and my question is more general beyond this area. As you were speaking, and I really enjoyed the presentation, I got to thinking about geography and religion. And religion and its edifices. I mean, in the Himalayas, the geography provides the cathedral, and the monasteries and the markers and things are just various forms of altars within this cathedral. And you go in the desert, and it may just be a mud hut, because geography provides, kind of man's relation to the great cosmos. But you go to the flat plains of Europe, and man created, the majesty in an edifice because the geography didn't provide it. And it would be interesting, you've done the geography of sacred places in Hawaii, in the Himalayas, but, what is the religious relationship to the geography in other parts of the world? And in places where you have a native culture that may have had very different edifices, say in South America, than when another culture moved in and took their European edifices and related to the geography a completely different way. It would be interesting to see other studies of other parts of the world with that same relationship.
Thank you. David? And then we'll ask others also.
The first question is, well, they're both great questions. Let me just try and answer the first one fairly quickly. The idea of separateness, I think, is an important thing, and thresholds and crossing space and moving outside the normal conventions of a person's life, sparking opportunities, I think, is very real. And what does it mean when these places become more accessible and more convenient to get to? Does that in some way diminish the opportunities for some kind of spiritual revelation when they're turned into tourism places? You can get there by road. I think that's partly maybe what you were getting at. And we were talking about that just earlier today, actually, because this is something that we're kind of grappling with conceptually in terms of the Mount Kailash region as it becomes integrated into the larger kind of political economy of China and essentially the world, and the infrastructures are developed to move people into that area with much greater ease. On the one hand, it makes it possible for more people to visit, but does that visit result in a similar kind of response because it is so easy? This is a great question. I don't have any particular answer. I just want to say that it's a great question. And I think it's a very real question and a very important question. And whether, with native peoples and indigenous peoples and sacred places elsewhere in the world, it's everywhere. And it's interesting for me as a Caucasian person living in North America, coming out of a Christian background, where Christianity is a religion that essentially was introduced to this place by people who are not of this place. So what is the connection between our religious system in an institutional way and the place where we live, other than if we personally make it one? I don't know that there is one, frankly. So that's very real. And I think you might have almost tried to say Hawaii when you started. And I have to say, Hawaii is one of my favorite places in the world. And it's the one place, more than Tibet, more than the Himalaya, it's the one place in the world where I feel that, whatever you want to call it, spiritual energy, the strongest. And it's also the one place in the world where I feel it the strongest, where it has been so dominated and conquered by immigrant populations, so that the Hawaiian people themselves have to work extremely hard to hold on to that. And it's a huge struggle within Hawaii, for sure. It's a major thing that's happening within Hawaii amongst indigenous Hawaiians anyway. So, yeah.
Thank you. Would you like to make any last-minute comments?
No, thank you.
Well, I just want to thank David for a truly beautiful, profound, and thought-provoking, really, presentation. So, and thank you also to all the discussants for really adding to the conversation, and thank you all for raising questions.